Okay. First off, I know you talked about this earlier today, but the thing that you had said about what the foundations of quantum mechanics say as to there's a couple of things. Obviously, the observer. Where does the observer fit in? And the hook or non-hook of consciousness in that.
Right.
And so if you could talk about that, and the probably more like this than like
yes, yeah. Something that happens in quantum mechanics. One of the important innovations of quantum mechanics is that a certain fantasy that held in physics up until then about the possibility of observing something entirely passively, observing it without affecting it in the process of observing it. However things turn out, it's fairly clear now that quantum mechanics will have ended that permanently. Looking at things involves interacting with them, and it involves interacting with them in a way whose effect can't be minimized, no matter how delicate your technology is, no matter how much money you spend. So that's a new feature of quantum mechanics. Okay, this is getting too long. I take it this is going to be edited so I can say stuff like that.
Now, were you saying by that, though, that they found now that the observer has no effect?
No, no. So, no. The process, the physical process of making a measurement has a very profound effect. There have been a whole bunch of speculations in the literature as to what it is about the process of making a measurement that has this effect, and how it is that the process of making measurements have the effects that they do. One of the speculations about this, which had its heyday in the 50s and 60s in the scientific and philosophical literature, was that the active agent here was consciousness. And people were excited about this for all sorts of obvious reasons. It was a very new sort of link between physics and something that had seemed altogether outside of physics up until then. Much of the talk in quantum mechanics that goes on in the film is centered around these speculations. And one of the points I wanted to make this morning was that those speculations haven't played a role in what I regard as the serious scientific and philosophical literature on this subject for 30 years or so. There was a certain period where people were speculating like that. There was, as I mentioned this morning, a series of progressively more and more embarrassing conversations of the form, well, can a cat cause these effects with its consciousness? Can a mouse cause these effects with its consciousness? Eventually, it was clear that the words involved here were so imprecise, were so slippery, that you weren't going to be able to build a useful scientific theory around them, and the idea was dropped. It's also the case that even if those ideas had turned out to be useful and true in physics, they wouldn't have produced the picture of the world that it seems to me we get in What the Bleep. Even if consciousness was the agent, all of these theories had the operations of this consciousness regulated by very strict, external, concrete, soulless, mathematical laws. The jump from the involvement of consciousness, even if it was there, to these larger claims like I create my own reality, I choose my experience, consciousness is the foundation of all being, there's room in the world for this intangible phenomenon of freedom, so on and so forth. These wouldn't have followed even if the consciousness picture of measurement had succeeded, and the consciousness picture of measurement didn't succeed. So those are the points I was trying to make about that this morning. I mean, these are all points in a negative vein. there is, the positive thing to say is that there's a huge amount of interesting work going on over the last 20 years, trying to understand how measurements do cause the effects that they cause. This work is all in a vein that, in the language of this film, would be called much more mechanistic, in the vein of a much more mechanistic picture of the world. This work has to do with trying to figure out how to alter the equations in order to produce these changes, or how to add physical things to our picture of the world in order to show how these changes come about. They're not at all centered on issues of the possible agency of consciousness anymore.
So the thing about the measurement is
Right.
do they look at that now as sort of that the measurement is a coupled system with the thing that they're trying to measure?
Yeah,
and that
there is something that's really, if you want to put your finger on one of the profound philosophical shifts between classical mechanics and quantum mechanics, it's that classical mechanics is built from the ground up around what we now know is a fantasy of the possibility of observing things passively, okay? Or the possibility of, at least if you get more and more careful, more and more closely approaching the position of observing things in a perfectly passive way. Observing things in such a way that you're sure that you're not, in the process of observing something, changing the very thing you're trying to observe. Quantum mechanics put a decisive end to that. This phenomenon of incompatible observables that I was talking about this morning makes it very clear that that there is a minimum and finite disturbance that you're going to have to cause to any system by measuring any particular one of its physical variables, and there is going to be no kind of technological advancement that can reduce it below that definite finite level. Mind you, everybody always knew that in order to measure a system you have to interact with it physically in one way or another, but like I say, the fantasy was that you could make this interaction more and more delicate as your technology got better. Quantum mechanics put a decisive end to that. Quantum mechanics gives us a theoretical, unsurpassable, finite minimum interaction which you must have with the system if you're going to get any information out of it. That's a very decisive change. So, this picture of passive observation is gone. Like I say, it was a tempting move in the context of a discovery like that to say, well, what do we mean by observation? What is it that's doing the disturbing? It was a natural thing to grab at something like consciousness. Observers have consciousness, so on and so forth. There were other things that they grabbed at just as instinctively. Macroscopicness, the macroscopicness of the measuring apparatus, as opposed to the microscopicness of the measured object. The cut between subject and object. There were all sorts of things to grab at. Consciousness was one of the things that was grabbed at. It was grabbed at very tentatively. It was in fairly short order followed up to the point where it looked like a dead end insofar as the progress of physics was concerned. And it hasn't played a role since then, except in certain attempts to appropriate quantum mechanics to other kinds of agendas, New Age agendas, or deconstructionist agendas, or post-structuralist agendas, or so on and so forth.
Now, could you talk a little bit? A lot of people have the notion that science is a very definite thing, and there is one thing, and all scientists agree on that, and that science moves forward by very orderly things of science doing experiments. And it seems like the history of science tells us something very different.
Of course you're right about that. Of course you're right about that, and this is something that has come much more to the center of people's attention over the past 30 years or so with the writings of people like Kuhn and so on and so forth. Science is a very messy, very back and forth, very complicated, very social, very human institution, like other institutions are. Of course, there isn't universal agreement among scientists, particularly about the foundations of quantum mechanics. Of course, there are messes all over the place. But if you just say that and leave it there, I think you're not doing the situation justice. I think, and this is again repeating something that I said this morning, there is still a really important distinction between two quite different ways that you can come at the world. Both of them are imperfect, both of them are messy, both of them are back and forth. But there is a posture of coming at the world with the demand that you're going to find something that makes you feel good, you're going to find something therapeutic, you're going to find that what lies at the center of the universe, what lies at the foundation of all being, is some attractive, powerful, safe, accessible, reassuring image of yourself. This is the way the Vatican came at the world in its dispute with Galileo. This is the way the Victorians came at the world in their dispute with Darwin. The problem that the Vatican had with Galileo is that humanity was being displaced from the center of the universe. The problem that that the Victorians had with Darwin is that the ancestry of man wasn't as dignified and wasn't as reassuring as people wanted it to be. It seems to me that one of the important historical distinctions that science is entitled to is that it's science that always represents the resistance to this impulse. It's science that always represents the demand that you come at the world with open and authentic wonder and with sharp, cold, clear eyes and in a way that's singularly intent on getting at the truth, whether the truth ends up being reassuring and therapeutic or not. The statements in the film of the form consciousness is the ground of all being, or our consciousness links up with the consciousness of the unified field, so on and so forth, I must say, and this is what was primarily disturbing to me, I hear in all this vivid echoes of the Vatican's position that the Earth is at the center of the universe, or of the anti-Darwinian position that man was created by God, that we're somehow specially important, that we somehow have a special role to play, or a special link, a special connection with what's at the foundation of the world. We don't know that. And our job in searching through the world is to find out if that's true or not to come to the world with a demand that it be true, or not to select which scientific theory to believe based on whether that scientific theory seems to endorse that kind of claim.
What about then the role of intuition? Let's say, because a lot of mystical writings or sages, whatnot, enlightened beings, they report certain things that they've experienced.
Right.
So that's more of let's say the intuitional side, where it may not be that they're predisposed to think a human's the center of the universe.
That's fair enough.
Yeah, they just
that's fair enough. Look, I think there are other ways of distinguishing between ways of coming at the world. There are great intellectual traditions of which I'm enormously respectful, of mystical access toward the world, of revelatory access toward the world. All sorts of stuff. Then there is a scientific tradition. And the scientific tradition is to approach the world, very roughly speaking, people talk about scientific method as if that's some distinct way of reasoning. Doesn't seem to me to be a distinct way of reasoning. What you mean by scientific method is some attempt to come at the world globally in the way you come at the project of getting a fire started, or building a house, or weaving your clothing, or something like that. There is this style of reasoning that we refer to as common sense. Okay? And the scientific project is essentially the project of seeing if we can expand the style of common sense as a complete approach to the world, as a complete approach to existence. I think this is an interesting and compelling project for two reasons. One, because common sense is a compelling way of reasoning. Two, because the project of applying common sense to the world as a whole has turned out to be spectacularly successful. On the other hand, it seems to me that you could perfectly well make an argument, look, common sense and not, say, mystical revelation is indeed the right way to fix your toaster. It's not the right way to decide what you think about God or what you think about the point of existence or something like that. For that you need entirely distinct methods. Both of these are very interesting claims to make, very respectable claims to make. All that I think is bad is to mix them up with one another.
Do you think that in the future, in time, I mean, both are purportedly looking into the nature of the universe,
right?
The big U,
right?
Everything,
right?
Do you think that there's a way in which at some point these will converge?
I don't see any reason to believe that. I think. So far, all of the announcements of this convergence, which are surely all over the place, have proven hollow once you look at them. So no, I don't see any. Indeed, I guess I see the opposite, and I guess I see. And this is another way of putting the point that I was trying to make this morning. For my money, the image of the world and of our place in the world that emerges through science is getting more and more uncomfortable for us as time goes by, is getting farther and farther from the image of us that emerges in the great religious traditions, the great mystical traditions, so on and so forth. We're being presented with a mechanical picture of ourselves by science that we don't know how to take in. And I think the interesting challenge of science to our imaginations is not that it's reproducing other bodies of knowledge that we have other kinds of access to, but that it's giving us something altogether different from all of those other traditions, something with an enormous amount of force behind it because of the success and the earned authority of the scientific technique, something that it's very hard for us to take in. It's very, very difficult for us to think about ourselves as the kind of mechanical devices that science seems to be telling us that we are. So, no, I don't see evidence of a convergence there. And indeed, what I think is exciting about the scientific project is precisely that the way as it goes on, it makes this tension more and more and more acute. The tension between the picture of ourselves we have from various other cultural traditions and the picture of ourselves we're getting from science. Once again, if you look at the progress, Galileo took us out of the center of the universe, where various religious traditions wanted to put us. Darwin took us out of divine creation, where various traditions wanted to put us. Freud displaced us in another way. I think the progress of science has been exactly away from convergence with all these traditions. And I think that's what's interesting and challenging about it. If all it was doing was converging with these other traditions, there'd be something redundant about it.
If you, let's say, in physics, of course, the Holy Grail is the theory of everything.
Mm-hmm.
So you would then have to say that it's not the theory of everything, it's the theory of the physical, everything in the physical universe.
Yeah, but you might want to add to that you think you have reason to believe that the physical universe is all the universe there is.
Right. Right. Now, but can science ever answer that question? That there is
whether the physical universe is all the universe there is?
Yeah.
Well, I'm not sure what it would be to answer that question definitively, but it's imaginable that physics could get to the point, okay, where it could say, look, I have a completely physical explanation of why you just moved your arm. I have a completely physical explanation of why you're now producing the sounds you're producing. I have a completely physical explanation of why you married the person that you did. I have a completely physical explanation of why you wrote all the words in your life that you did. If physics gets to that point, there's going to be more and more of a pressing question of the form. Look, this other stuff you believe in, this non-physical stuff that you believe in, what's it for? What work is it doing in the world? We have a complete account here in terms of physics of everything that seems to be going on, of why you believe, of why you say to people that you believe you have free will. We're going to have a physical account of why you say to people that you believe the world isn't completely physical. That's not going to be a proof that the world is completely physical, but it is going to raise a very awkward question for the person who wants to deny physicalism, if physics gets to this point, mind you. I don't know that it will, okay? But if it does, okay, then there's going to be a very acute question of the form, look, this other stuff you believe in, soul or spirit or whatever it is, what does it do? What's it for? We've got the account of everything in terms of the motions of these particles. Okay? We've already established that it's not what makes you say what you say, it's not what makes you write what you write, it's not what makes you marry who you marry. What work is it doing? Things could come to that.
So the brain actually has some really distinct characteristics that separate it from a computer. The brain is actually a laboratory, and by our design and by our own will, it acts as a laboratory to take concepts, ideas, and models, and in the certain part of the brain it builds those concepts and ideas, and it says, I'll take a little bit from what I learned here, and a little bit from what I remember here, and a little bit of my experience here, and let me take those specific areas and ask the what-ifs, the possibilities, the potentials, contemplate on designs or ideals that are outside the boxes of what our present understanding is, to come up with a new understanding or an enlarged box. So the brain acts as a laboratory. It's an architect. It designs models and it puts the pieces together, and its main function is to come up with a new picture, a new concept. And by repeating it over and over again, there comes a moment when we become so involved in that concept, so involved in that idea, that we lose our attention or our awareness on our external environment, on the signals that are coming from our body to our brain, and on relative time, because all of our awareness has gone within. It's gone to that concept and idea. The moment that happens, that picture, that model, gets pushed or moves to the frontal lobe. And the frontal lobe is the area of the brain that is the executive. When an idea or a concept makes it to the frontal lobe without our mind wandering to a shopping list and the pain in our back and what time it is and who we have to call and our relationships. We put all those aside, and we no longer keep re-accessing or re-interacting with parts of the brain that are already known within that box, but we're taking those individual concepts and models and ideas and building a bigger concept, and we lose track of our association to people, to places, to things, to times, to events, and we are completely focused on or concentrated on that idea. That's the moment that that idea makes it to the frontal lobe. And when that concept makes it to the frontal lobe, it becomes more real than the external environment. We lose track of the external environment. And that internal picture now that becomes more real than the external environment is literally where reality is happening, because all of our awareness is there. At that moment, another part of the brain becomes activated. That part of the brain is called the cerebellum. It is the oldest part of the brain. It has millions of connections per neuron as opposed to thousands of connections per neuron in the neocortexes. And that ability for that brain to become activated literally endorses or gives life to that model and causes the brain to become rewired and actually change reality, our perception of reality. The best way that a human being can become that observer is, first of all, having the awareness or the understanding intellectually that they don't always have to make the same choices over and over again. And secondly, be put in certain situations experimentally in your own personal life where you actually override those mechanisms in your body, and that takes practice. It's not something that we can do immediately because there is a tendency biologically for us to respond to preserve the body. The brain has certain centers in it that are only concerned with the preservation of the body. And the moment that we respond, those centers kick in, and it becomes almost breaking the habit of being human. We have to gain control and override those physiological functions that happen in our body. And the moment that we do that, each time we override those physiological responses, we're changing brain chemistry and actually breaking the addiction to that stimulus and response that so many people live by every day.
Is there a physical change that happens in the brain, or is it just in some nebulous mind state that this change happens?
Well, in order to explain the physiological chemistry in the brain, let's just back up here and give you just a little bit more on anatomy and brain function so that we can address the chemical changes that take place in the body. But remember, we talked about that tree that has all those branches that connect to other trees, and every place that it connects forms a thought or a memory. And that memory becomes wired in the brain. And if we get a series of experiences and information, we call that whole cluster of neurons a neural net. Well, every experience that we've had in our life that the brain builds on, it builds on a law of association. In other words, we learn about an apple by understanding first that it's red, and then we understand that it's round and it's smooth and it tastes a certain way, and it makes a certain noise when you bite into it. And so we develop a neural net that describes ourselves in terms of our interaction with an apple through our five senses. But if we start as a child, started to realize that not all apples are red, that they could actually be green, the moment we understand that all of a sudden causes the neural net to take more of a shape. And we actually build concepts based on this law of association. What we see, what we smell, what we taste, what we hear, what we feel. And by the second law, which is the law of repetition, which says that if we do something over and over and over again, by the mere fact that we're repeating it, the process of learning whatever we're learning starts to become simple. It starts to become automatic. It starts to become familiar. It starts to become easy. It starts to become natural. it starts to become subconscious. It almost starts to become unconscious. So the law of association and the law of repetition put together causes those nerve cells to literally become hardwired. As we repeat a process, whatever skill we're repeating, those connections in the brain start releasing certain chemicals called nerve growth factor. And that nerve growth factor acts almost like a miracle grow to cause a long-term relationship between one neuron and the next neuron. And that's what causes us to go from something that we have to put so much conscious awareness on and so much attention on to learn, to all of a sudden to be able to do something automatically and easily. It's because we literally wire it to the extent that holographically or dimensionally it starts interacting without our conscious mind. It becomes natural and becomes easy. So we have those same mechanisms structurally in our brain for certain attitudes or certain emotions that we live by on a daily basis. All the attitudes that we have had experiences with in our lifetime based on how we live. For example, the neocortexes in the brain, which are the where conscious awareness exists, is where all those connections take place. So everybody that we meet has their own series of intellectual experiences and experiences that they've had in their life, whether they were raised in a single family, whether they were raised in with many children, whether they were went to college, whether they studied art, whether they studied law, whether they studied music, what their religious beliefs were, what their culture was, where they lived geographically. All of that forms that neural net in our brain. If they were loved and encouraged as a child, or if they were abused physically. And so all those experiences shape neurologically the very fabric of what's taking place in our perception or in our world. Those exact processes in terms of neural nets also exist in our brain. And when we respond to our environment, certain aspects of those particular neural nets are going to kick on or click on that are going to cause chemical changes in the brain that are ultimately going to cascade chemicals that run through our body. So, absolutely.
So you described the neural nets as basically these trees that basically wire themselves together, which is a very mechanistic sort of point of view. You're wiring together little circuits. Where it's been suggested that the brain is actually holographic, which is not necessarily a hard wiring of the circuits, which isn't happening to be both of them.
Great question, and scientists are debating that as we speak.
What are they debating?
Absolutely, the scientists are debating whether the brain is actually hardwired or if it has what we call neuroplasticity or elasticity. And the answer to the question right now is yes. We have parts of the brain that are hardwired by repetition. For example, the example I used of riding a bicycle. You don't have to think about riding a bicycle now. Neurologically, you have that wired, and all you have to do is access that part of your brain to be able to jump on the bicycle, and within moments, you'll be able to reformulate that mechanism, but that's hardwired. However, if I ask you to take certain concepts and ideas and follow a train of thought with me, those neurons literally that are available to still be imprinted upon are not static. They're not a tree that has branches. They're very elastic and they're very alive. And those very, very fine dendrites, we call them, or the fingers of those trees, can actually unhook and rehook to other nerve cells within seconds. How does that happen? It takes concentration, it takes focused attention, and it takes will to be able to cause those wiring mechanisms to take place. By the same means, it also takes concentration, will, and awareness to be able to stop those connections of hardwired habits that we have and we live by on a daily basis.
There is this
debate in quantum mechanics about, we're affecting things on the micro level, not the macro level. And you've seen in some of the panels at the conference that there's a point beyond which they're not willing to go. And we can sit and discuss those things for a long time, and then we can go and do certain things that can negate what they think is possible. So what do we do with, on the one hand, the scientific model of what they're trying to develop, and then people having these experiences that are complete anomalies? What do we do with those two things?
Well, I think if we keep quantum physics and the understanding very simple for the layperson, that our observation has a direct effect on our world, I think if we keep it very simple, then people can get about the business of beginning to practice the skill of observation. See, the subatomic world responds to our observation, but the average person loses their attention span every 6 to 10 seconds per minute. So that doesn't leave a lot of room for our attention span. So how could a very large respond to someone who doesn't have the ability to even focus and concentrate? Maybe we're just poor observers. Maybe we haven't mastered the skill of observation, and maybe it is a skill. And maybe we're so addicted to the external world and so addicted to the stimulus and response to the external world that the brain is beginning to work out of response instead of out of creation. If we're given the proper knowledge and the proper understanding and given the proper instruction, we should begin to see measurable feedback in our life. If you make the effort to sit down and design a new life, and you make it the most important thing, and you spend time every day feeding it like a gardener feeds a seed, you will produce fruit. It may take some time in the beginning, and it may take some time in developing the art to control your mind from all the things that it needs to do. But most people stop because they look for the results in their world after a small amount of effort. And when they don't see those results, they immediately discount its possibility. And yet, right on the other side of that, right past that point where they stopped, is the potential still existing. We're lazy as human beings. We live in a convenience world, and if we don't get our quick, immediate fix on what we need, we're impatient. Quantum law responds to that as well. But we should be willing to sit down every day and take a piece of our day and set it aside and give thanks that we're alive, and give thanks that we have life, and give thanks for the life that we have. And then begin to observe by pure sincerity to design a new possible future for ourselves. And if we do it properly and we observe it properly, we should have opportunities begin to show up in our life, not equal to what we can predict, but outside of our prediction. It must be outside of our prediction, because when it is, we know that it's come from a greater mind. If it's equal to our prediction, then we're creating more of the same. How could we create a new world if we can predict the outcome? We're not creating anything new. And so, to look for feedback in our world, the brain loves feedback. It likes to know when it's succeeded or it's actually accomplished a task so that it'll do it again. And so, that sincerity and that level of mind gives people the opportunity then to apply first some principles of choosing the potential reality and observing it. And by doing it, they're willing to say, I know quantum physics works for the very tiny. I'm aware that it works for the very tiny as well. But when do you become a maverick and say, all of the greats that have ever lived has said it's always start with a thought or a dream, and why not get about the business of applying it to your own personal life? It's not that the quantum field doesn't respond, it's that we have to up our level of will and sincerity. And when that happens, we'll see measurable results in our life.
So, these so-called spiritual endeavors, is there a way to create measurable results?
There's in our spiritual endeavors, and spirit is always kind of a connotation that people get stuck on, but in the application of our life is spiritual. Everything in life is spiritual, but in the application of it, there is absolutely a way in which we can begin to see measurable results in our life. It takes practice, and it's a skill.
One of the most popular things in the film, of course, is you talking about creating your day. And, there's two single moments in the film that are the highlights, and that's one of them, and the other one is the water crystal exhibition. Where did you come up with the idea of creating your day?
Well, it's actually not my idea. There's a school in the Pacific Northwest of the United States called Brahmta School of Enlightenment, and all the students in that school create their day. All of the students in that school get serious about actually no longer becoming the victim of their day, but actually blessing the day and allowing it to unfold equal to their will. Now, everybody has their own measurable level of will. But if we practice our mental rehearsal and our skill in being able to do it will show that certain brain circuits will grow as a result of our effort. It'll get easier to do, in other words. If we accept that idea, then it will allow us to go back the next day and do it with more certainty and with more acceptance. That in itself is no different than praying. You see, there's no religious text that says thought doesn't matter. There's no religious text that doesn't say your prayer and your intention shouldn't be answered by God. But explaining how that happens is what quantum physics and the observer is all about. But still, when we can make thought more real than anything else, our brain is designed to do that. The frontal lobe, with its enormous space, is the altar in which we place a thought. And it gives us the permission to hold the thought for an extended period of time, and it lowers the volume to the external stimuli. We lose track of time and space. That's the moment we're stepping into the quantum field. That's the moment that now we're making thought more real than anything else. So when I create my day, my interpretation, what you saw in the movie is my interpretation of what I do. In other words, if I'm going to sit down and create my day, if I'm going to make the effort, then I am bold enough to ask for a response. I'm bold enough to say, I want it to come and I want it to be a way that eliminates all of my doubt, and I want it to be just right outside the boundaries of what I can accept or what I can predict, and bring it in a way that usually will keep me in surprise or keep me in wonder, so that it inspires me to do it again and to learn more and to apply more knowledge to my next creation.
If you're the observer in that process, then who are you talking to?
Well, it's a great question. There's actually me, the observer. That's my personality, my free-willed self, given permission to do whatever I want in my life. Everybody has that free will. And then we have a constant aspect of ourself, the observer who's observing life in all of things. It is the force, the intelligence, the will that holds it all together. Now, every human being has that is alive. They're connected to it. And it is allowing and loving enough to give us life independent of our moods, our choices, our opinions. When that observer is observing life into me, and I emulate that same principle in observing my life, I am enacting the same action as the observer creating life. I am creating a life. And when we align with that principle, we are emulating our greatest potential, which is creation.
do we live in a pre-established artifact of some kind? So I just want to bump that idea. Is there an artifact out there of objective reality? Because there's also this idea that we're creating reality.
Let's see how I'm going to answer this.
I'm just asking this. These are very common questions.
Yeah.
I
think that there's a very strong, unanimous social agreement amongst human beings because we experience the same things externally in our world, and our brain really maps a reflection of all the experiences that we can have in our world. So there is a unanimous agreement of the laws that govern 3 dimensions, 4 dimensions even. And we live by those laws, and our brain really has mapped all the possibilities and potentials over pretty much eons of experience. But there's still room for the brain to grow, and there's still room for us to evolve to greater virtues and to greater levels of mind. If that's the case, then it means then that we have to begin to break from the social agreements and the social consciousness that keeps everything intact and everything in order. That means then that we have to really gain knowledge that's outside of convention. Whether it's social convention or religious convention or scientific convention, we have to reach for information and knowledge that is beyond the boundaries of what's currently accepted. Now, to personalize that information and knowledge means we're going to apply it to actually try it out to have a new experience. Once we have that experience now, it begins to change the way in which our world should show up or present itself to us. But an experience isn't enough. We have to be able to reproduce that experience until it can become automatic. Once we do that, now we're beginning to master a new level of mind, and then we start to break from the agreements of 4 dimensions. We begin to defy the principles of this social agreement, and it is a collective consciousness, and the collective order allows the quantum field to respond to that, but by the same means we have the ability to be able to process greater levels of mind, which then starts to separate us from this social agreement, and now we become individuals.
So, my first question for you is, over and over, we heard, in fact, yesterday Marley said how everyone comes up to her and says how your water crystals were the part of the movie where it really struck people. Why is that?
まず最初思うには、やはりとてもシンプルで分かりやすかったということがあると思いますね。で、普通の一般の人が科学とか何も知らないような人がとても入りやすい、世界であったというふうに思います。検体の水
For one sample of water, we drop about 0.5 cc's onto each 50 petri dishes.
50のシャワーに分けます。そしてその50の
Then we take those 50 petri dishes and freeze them in a freezer at minus 25 degrees Celsius for about 3 hours.
3時間ほど凍らせます。そして
We take those frozen samples into a refrigerator that is set at minus 5 degrees Celsius, where a microscope with a camera is set up. There we take photographs of each of the 50 water drops individually. We first take photographs of water that we did not put any information in. Then we take the water with information and do the same procedure just described. We take those before and after photographs and compare the differences.
それは水に愛、あるいは
When we
感謝と
projected the
いう思い
feeling
を
of love and thanks to water, we made the most beautiful crystal.
過去に一番美しい結晶を
At
作ったわ
times
け
like
です
this,
から、
I think
その時
water
が
is
一
at
番
peace.
水は平和だと思うんですね。
I read somewhere they use a dark field microscope. What is a dark field microscope?
ヨーロッパの方で、そういう実験がございます。アンシア系の顕微鏡を使うわけですが、その場合には水を凍らせません。水を、なんて言うんでしょうね。このペトリ実習に、なんていうのプレパラートに水を垂らすんですね。そして、垂らした、今度は乾いていきます。その乾いたその状況を、そのアンシア顕微鏡で覗くわけです。そうすると、そのパターンがいろいろと、その変わってくるということによって、水の情報を分析するという方法がございます。
Okay, recently in November you had a Water and Peace Festival. How is water connected to peace?
はい。ギリシャの哲学者タレスが紀元前前に、言ったように、水は万物の源であるというふうに、私は信じています。で、その水自体がやはり、平和でないと、やはり源が平和でないと、世の中も平和ではないと思うんですね。で、はっきり申し上げて、その水が平和ではないわけです。どういう状態の時に水は平和なのかということを、私の研究によって考察すれば、それは水に愛あるいは感謝という思いを強く持った時に水は過去に一番美しい結晶を作ったわけですから、そういう時が一番水は平和だと思うんですね。そういうようなことを我々一人一人の人間が考えてみるときに、水に対して本当に愛とか感謝なんとかということを思ったことがあるだろうか。私の過去の人生においてもほとんどございません。ようやくそういったことに気がついた最近は水に対して愛と感謝を持つようになりましたが、おそらく、60億の人たちのほとんどはそうではなかったと思いますね。ですからまず全ての万物である水に対して愛と感謝の思いを持ち、そしてその全ての水が美しい結晶を示すような環境というものを作ることによって人類の恒久の平和というものの道に私は近づいて、それが前提としてあるんではないかというふうに信じています。
The meaning of quantum physics is really in terms of giving us a new worldview that shows clearly how consciousness can be and is the ground of our being. In other words, quantum physics enables us to see directly that we can make sense of the world only if we base the world on consciousness. World is made of consciousness. World is consciousness. Consciousness is the ground of being. Quantum physics makes this as clear as daylight.
How is quantum physics clear as day?
Because quantum physics shows you clearly that science, quantum mathematics, which is, in our belief, the most fundamental mathematics, most accurate mathematical description of nature that we have discovered. This mathematics shows us clearly that the movement of objects are describable only in terms of possibilities. not the actual events that happens in our experience. Quantum physics calculates only possibilities. But if we accept this, then the question immediately comes, who, what chooses among these possibilities to bring the actual event of experience? So we directly, immediately see that consciousness must be involved. The observer cannot be ignored. Observer is part of the description of the world, but the observer is not included in quantum physics. We can only describe the objects, not the subject. So we get the idea that the subject must be more fundamental than the objects. Consciousness is more fundamental. Consciousness must be the ground of being, of which objects are part, but not all of it. And these objects then can be described as waves of possibility, and quantum physics succeeds in giving this description very accurately and gives probabilities so that we can do science on the basis of it whenever there is a large number of objects and large number of events. But when you speak of individual objects and individual events, then this very intriguing choice, the word choice by consciousness, out of these possible events, the actual event of experience comes in. And so, for the first time, science encounters free will. Consciousness is free because there is no mathematical description of the subject in our science. Only objects can be described mathematically, and only to the extent that there are possibilities. The question still remains paramount: who is the chooser? And when we see that, then we see that the chooser is free. There is freedom of choice. And of that freedom of choice comes our actual experience. Those are the discontinuous experiences that I was telling you about. Now, of course, we get conditioned, and then the certain apparent continuity reigns, and that's what misleads us, that's what confuses us.
The conditioning confuses us.
Conditioning brings up an apparent continuity in our experience.
So how does that translate the observer and consciousness? How does in quantum physics and the understanding of how the world works, how does that translate down to me?
That's of course is the ultimate to the issue. What does all this observer or collapse of possibility wave, as the physicists would say, into an actual event of experience? From that, how do we get to me? Now that me, as I said, is the result of a lot of conditioning. So although ideally in every experience we get a whole bunch of possible responses, but in what happens because of our memory, quantum measurement, every observation can be looked upon as a quantum measurement. This quantum measurement produces brain memory. These brain memories are activated every time we encounter an experience again. A repeated stimulus will always elicit not only the original impression, but also this repetition of memory impressions. And it is this working of the memory, I sometimes put it this way: we always perceive something after reflection in the mirror of memory. It is this reflection in the mirror of memory that gives us that sense of I-ness, who I am, namely a pattern of habits, a pattern of memories, a pattern of past, and that is where I enter the picture. All of our meanings of who I am come from this reflection on the mirror of memory. So we miss the quantum discontinuity. And because we miss it, that's why we ask, well, but that is not me. Because quantum is talking about discontinuous quantum leaps, possibilities and probabilities, free will. But we find in our ordinary me, all these things are quite elusive. The illusion will be cleared up only when we are prepared to work a little. We have to work our way back to this freedom, to this consciousness as the holder of the freedom of choice. If we work our way back, then this question that you asked, how does it relate to me, will become clearer and clearer.
So I'm wondering, like, which came first, the chicken or the egg? You know, then did consciousness come first, or where did consciousness come from? I don't even answer that question. But
the consciousness is the ground of being, therefore it is the one and the original. The chicken and the egg question, however, is very important. For example, how does this one consciousness become a subject-object split experience? There, when we analyze it fully, and here I must mention Dag Hofstadter's book, Gödel, Escher, Bach, where there's a good analysis of this question. And we find indeed that how consciousness becomes split into a subject of experience and an object, which is subject experiences, how this split occurs. This has to do with what we call a chicken and egg kind of hierarchy, which technically Hofstadter calls tangled hierarchy. This hierarchical tangle is inherently present in a quantum measurement. Quantum measurement is not a simple hierarchical process. Instead, it's a tangled hierarchical process involving the object, involving the brain, involving how we experience the world. So because the quantum measurement involving the brain is tangled hierarchical, this chicken and the egg kind of, chicken or the egg which came first kind of hierarchy, we cannot really decide it. There is no decision. They both are as important in the hierarchy. When we realize that, then we can understand how our self-reference arises. This subject-object split arises from a quantum measurement. It's a little bit like the picture of drawing hands by M.C. Escher. You might have seen it. The left hand draws the right and the right hand draws the left. But who is really drawing them? It's not really either one. It's really Escher that is drawing them both. Similarly, subject and object seem to arise from tangled hierarchical quantum measurement in the brain, but it's really not the brain that is causing it. Just as left hand and right hand in the picture is not really causing the picture. What is causing the picture is M.C. Escher, which is outside of the picture, transcends the picture. The same thing, consciousness is ultimate creator of the downward causation, creator of the illusory separateness of subject and object. Although from inside it seems like subject is creating the object and the object is creating the subject. But ultimately it's neither. It's really consciousness. This subject-object split is an illusory manifestation. It seems that way.
Then why do I feel separate from you?
That's precisely the point. So I'm an object in your consciousness. You're identifying with your brain, which is also an object in your consciousness, but you're identifying with it. That's what tangled hierarchy does. Now it's making sense to you, I'm sure. That's what every one of us have, that I-ness. This brain is special because this is the subject of my experience, and I'm looking at you. You are an object in my consciousness, in my awareness. You are separate from me. You are secondary also because I, the vehicle of this brain that I identify with, is seeing you as an object in my consciousness. So you are secondary to me. All this is the result of this tangled hierarchy and this conditioning of that identity.
So ultimately, if I am able to let go of the subject-object and just accept the concept that we are all one, then that would alleviate the separateness?
Yes, accept is the first step. But remember, it still has to come to you that inseparate notion has to come to you directly. The observer is the observed. This is a quotation from the mystic Jiddu Krishnamurti. Observer is the observed, but it's not just a conceptual reckoning of that. If you just conceptually reckon it, then it's good. It's a good starting point. But then meditate on it, and then that subject-object split will disappear. And that's what we call, in East Indian jargon, is samadhi, or Zen Buddhist jargon is satori, or in Christian jargon, an encounter with the Holy Spirit, because in the Holy Spirit there is no subject-object split.
So then you really have to make a distinction then between philosophy or knowledge or concept and experience.
Philosophy and knowledge or concept are all secondary to this experience of wisdom. In this wisdom, there is no separateness. The separateness shrinks to the recognition that observer is the observed. Whereas the split comes in the identification with part of the object spectrum, namely my brain. So when we recognize directly, by direct experience, that we are capable of bridging that separateness, then I know that there really isn't any separateness ultimately. I am one, for the sake of experience have become two or many, but it's only an illusory separateness. I am still one, because this separateness is just an imposition on my oneness, just as we make chalk marks on a blackboard. The board remains unity, however many chalk marks I have made. So consciousness remains that one always, except that many experiences, many manifest experiences are being created in this consciousness, which then become the source of our apparent separateness and confusion.
So the reason that I'm looking and seeking these answers, or why is this important to me? Because it helps me stop feeling so separate and sad and alone, or does it tell me that I can create money in my hand, I don't have to worry about all working, or what does it kind of mean to me, all of this stuff that we just...
So step by step. The first thing that as soon as you hear this, 70s are a good example when Fred Alan Wolf actually first coined this phrase, I create my own reality. So what did the New Agers do? Well, the New Agers, I'm just using this phrase New Ager, not pejoratively, please, but as a description of the people who were influenced by the physics that was getting done at that time. And the physics was very elementary. We were imposing some new phrases on a still predominantly materialistic belief system. The belief system was that everything is made of matter, and therefore material investigations and material pursuits are very important. So what did we do? We came on that, we superimposed on that this new dictum, quantum physics dictum. Dictum is correct. I create my own reality. And the first thing that people started creating are Cadillacs, right? There was a whole tradition that got created in one spiritual tradition comes to mind, I don't mention name, but they actually meditated that way, meditated to manifest material wealth. I'll manifest a Cadillac for myself. Very soon, however, it was recognized that Cadillac is a little bit hard. So some traditions, some very famous teaching traditions, which again I won't mention names, they started giving the idea that we can at least create parking spaces. Remember that? That's in the 70s. So we did that. But after a while, it became clear, thanks to Ludwig Buss in Australia, myself at Oregon, and Casey Blood at Rutgers, it became clear that the place from where we choose to create my own reality, that place of consciousness is a very special, non-ordinary state of being. where the subject-object split tend to disappear. The samadhi or satori that I was telling you about. And it is from this non-ordinary state that I choose. And therefore, the ordinary exaltation of the New Ager also disappeared until it was forced to face the reality that there is really no free lunch. We have to meditate and reach these non-ordinary states of consciousness before we become the creator of our own reality. That took a while, but now I think finally people are recognizing that there is no shortcut, but the cut is not that long either. It's not that hard. It's not that hard. We have been engaging in creativity for a very long time. We have created a great amount of art, music, even science, great amount of it. So there are many people who are experienced with creative process that eventually leads to this discontinuous leap towards this non-ordinary state of consciousness. As this is being clear, we are getting a new wave of a new generation of enthusiastic investigators who are ready to take this leap. And then it means a whole lot to me because I become different in the process. I become empowered in the process. I become a lover of creativity in the process. I become transformed in the process. I'm capable of experiencing reality at a much more subtle level, in a much more loving level, if you will. And I become happier. I really begin to participate in the whole movement. David Bohm's word comes to mind, holo movement. I become a participant of the total movement of consciousness, not just my individual, very solipsistic movements that I'm familiar with. So my whole looking worldview, my whole looking of reality, my worldview becomes different, much more alive. Instead of playing in a small pond, or to use the baseball jargon, in playing in a sandlot ball game, we play in the bigger arena of the world itself. We become a citizen of the universe.
How about, this has always been confusing to me, how does social consciousness play into all this? If I can create my own reality and I'm creating you, are you creating me, or how do we end up creating each other?
That's the whole point. So the social consciousness is basic of it, because the place from which I create, you and I become one. So I can look at your interest and you can look at my interest without any difficulty whatsoever, because this individual selfishness, they just disappear. It's just an illusion. It doesn't exist at that level. But actually, when you analyze this, then it's a little bit more subtle. Why? Because it is still this I that does identify, this individual that does identify. This I has to prepare the groundwork for that leap to that non-ordinary state that I sometimes call the quantum self. So this ego is important in that dance, in the sense that the ego has to prepare, and then when that leap occurs to the quantum self, and we have the great insight, the ego has to manifest that insight. So ego comes in at both manifestation stage and the preparation stage. And because of that, it's a dance of the ego and the quantum self both. We cannot disregard the individuality completely. This is where spiritual traditions sometimes make a mistake. They think that God is everything, their word for quantum self is God. God is everything, there's no meaning to the individual, so they denigrate the individual movement. It is both the movement of the individual and the movement of the whole. It cannot be otherwise.
I'm going to go back to something you said about, in the film, the integration of the quantum and the neurology and That's sort of the biology part. Because we purposely in the film kind of left that vague so that people could put it together for themselves. And they're very interested in the science behind that. How do you see them fitting together?
Well, you did a very nice job in fitting them together in one way in the film. And that is both really see both of these disciplines, modern quantum physics and molecular biology, neuroimmunology, they both say that we do create our own realities and that we have a lot of responsibility over the world in which we live, at least the way we experience the world and the way the world behaves towards us. That's a very good connection, actually. That was brilliant. Ultimately, what we'd like to see is, what is the physics of consciousness? We can ask that question today. What is consciousness? Where does it come from? What are the origins of consciousness? What are the limits of human potential? We're in a position to actually answer that now, I believe, although there's certainly not consensus yet in the scientific community about that. But with the real cutting-edge knowledge, the discovery of the unified field, the so-called superstring field, we now understand that life is fundamentally one. At the basis of all life's diversity, there is unity. At our basis, you and I are one. And that unity, at the basis of mind and matter, is consciousness, universal consciousness. So with that deep understanding that consciousness isn't created by the brain, it's not purely an outcome of molecular chemical processes in the brain, but is fundamental in nature. It's the very core of nature. We call it the unified field. Now that we have that foundational understanding of what consciousness is, we can solve the mind-body problem. We can see how consciousness percolates up through our physiology to become the consciousness that we experience and see and sensory perception and all of that. So there is a foundation now to really link rigorously neuroscience with quantum physics. That might be really a next step in the development of the movie. You've asked the questions in the first movie. Now we're just on the verge of being able to answer those questions.
So you mentioned the unified field. For people who a lot of people are going, well, that sounds nice, it's unified, everything's one. Could you dive a little more technically into what the unified field is?
Progress in our understanding of the universe through physics over the past quarter century has been exploring deeper levels of natural law, from the macroscopic to the microscopic, from the molecular to the atomic to the nuclear to subnuclear levels of nature's functioning, so-called electroweak unified scale, grand unified scale, super unified scale. And what we've discovered at the core basis of the universe, the foundation of the universe, is a single universal field of intelligence, a field which unites gravity with electromagnetism, light, with radioactivity, with the nuclear force, so that all the forces of nature and all the so-called particles of nature, quarks, leptons, protons, neutrons, are now understood to be one. They're all just different ripples on a single ocean of existence. That's called the unified field or superstring field, and it's a mathematical tour de force. But we have realized Einstein's dream. He dedicated half of his life to discovering this unified field, and now in the context of the superstring, that has been achieved. So unified field theories based on the superstring identify a single universal field of intelligence, an ocean of existence, at the basis of everything, mind and matter. And all the so-called particles of the universe, the forces in our universe, everything in the universe are just ripples on that ocean of existence. That's the unified field. And that field is a non-material field. It is ultimately the field of consciousness. And all our separate consciousness, wherever there's consciousness, is merely consciousness by virtue of the fact that my consciousness, your consciousness, are ultimately that. Everything in the universe is really nothing but that. Planets, trees, people, animals, we're all just waves of vibration of this underlying unified superstring field. We are really united at our core. And ultimately the understanding that's emerging will be that there is only one consciousness in this room. And it is you. And it is me. And it is each and every one of us We individualize our consciousness through the filter of our nervous system. But the consciousness itself, our very inner subjectivity, the self in the big sense, that is universal. And knowing that, knowing it through experience, is called enlightenment, and has been called enlightenment through the ages.
It sounds like you're going down through the physical realms, leptons, smaller, and you're saying at the base, it's not solid, it's intelligence. Why do you use the word intelligence?
That is a very brilliant question. What you're saying really reflects a bias that all of us share. Everyone who's grown up in the scientific world is used to the concept that we're living in a material universe, an inert universe, a universe of dead matter. And because of that, it's difficult instinctively to grasp that we're not really living in a dead universe, that the universe is overwhelmingly conscious at its basis. See, what we have seen and studied for 300 years of classical physics is what we call billiard ball mechanics, macroscopic physics, classical physics, the physics of billiard balls, cannonballs, and planets. But quantum mechanics, even at the molecular level, let alone atomic, nuclear, subnuclear, in the realm of quantum mechanics, the idea of particle is replaced by the idea of wave function. And what is a wave function? Technically, it's a vector in a linear space. Well, what's a vector in a linear space? What's it made of? What's the substance of nature? Well, a wave function, a vector in a linear space, is made of the same stuff thoughts are made of. We're really living in a thought universe, a conceptual universe. Quantum mechanics is just the play and display of potentiality. So the point I'm making is the deeper you go in the structure of natural law, the less material, the less inert, the less dead the universe is, the more alive, the more conscious the universe becomes. Then when you get to the foundation of the universe, the unified field or superstring field, it's simply a field of pure being, pure intelligence. Intelligence, because it's the fountainhead of all the laws of nature, all the fundamental forces, all the fundamental particles, all the laws governing life at every level of the universe have their unified source in the unified field. That makes the unified field the most concentrated field of intelligence in nature. Non-material, dynamic, self-aware intelligence. Those are the properties of the unified field.
Could you also use the term, because I've read this someplace, some people are saying at the bottom, it's also information. Is that kind of similar, or is that another way to describe the same thing?
It's very similar. I'd say the quantum world, quantum mechanics, is really the play and display of information, the play and display of potentiality, waves of information, waves of potential electron. And it's important, the word potential. This isn't the world of electrons, it's the world of potential electrons. But when you have to ask the question, waves of what, really? What is the field that is waving? Is it the ocean? No, it's a universal ocean, an ocean of pure potentiality, an ocean of abstract potential existence. We call it the unified field, or superstring field. And that's what we're made of. So, as you said, the tighter physics have tried to grasp onto physical reality, to understand what it's really made of. What are the core building blocks of life? At the basis of it all, life, the universe, slips through your fingers. And you come up with something that's increasingly abstract to come to the realm of pure abstraction. And that's what the unified field is. It's pure abstract potential, pure abstract being, pure abstract self-aware consciousness, which rises in waves of vibration to give rise to the particles, the people, everything we see in the vast universe.
That was great. I got awesome goosebumps on that one.
Why? I don't know. This is a big question. I'm never going to answer it, but I've always asked this question of all the people that I keep talking to because it seems so obvious to me most of what you're saying. It just seems very natural. Why are we not educating? How do we get so? If the Vedics seem to have it right such a long time ago, how do we end up here?
Boy, that's a good question. How is knowledge lost? The knowledge of enlightenment can easily be lost. The techniques to experience pure consciousness, unbounded awareness, can easily be lost, not because they're difficult or complicated, but because they're so subtle. Very interesting. In order to transcend, to experience unbounded awareness, consciousness has to settle down completely. Now, if you try and reproduce that experience, you'll never succeed, because trying involves effort, and effort keeps the awareness active and the comprehension from expanding. That's why a very delicate technique is involved, and personal instruction is involved. It's easy, it's natural, but it's delicate. And it's easy to lose it, and I'm afraid it has been lost completely. It's being revitalized again and again throughout history. Of course, Maharshi's own life is dedicated to teaching as many people as possible how to transcend and regain that experience. But unfortunately, we have a society with a certain momentum. We have generations of teachers who've gone to teachers' education or members of teachers' unions that don't always support educational innovation. So it may take a generation, unfortunately, it may take a generation. Now that simple techniques, universal, non-sectarian, scientifically verified techniques exist to gain enlightenment, it still may take a generation before these life-saving technologies to develop consciousness are reintroduced into education.
You said non-sectarian. Does that mean like non-religious? Is that what you mean by that?
The experience of pure consciousness really transcends any one religion or any one philosophy. It's as scientific as it is religious. It is, after all, a state of functioning of the brain, maximally expanded comprehension. It's the direct subjective experience of the scientifically discovered unified field of all the laws of nature. Is that religious? Perhaps, but it's scientific too. So there's no reason that it should be disbarred from education. Otherwise, we're going to get the same old result. 5% development of our mental potential, another generation of war and terrorism and human cruelty. And that'll go on forever until the experience of life's essential unity is bestowed and the brain is properly developed.
We talked to Jeffrey Satinover and Hameroff, and I think maybe one other physicist said the same thing, that because you talk a lot about the observer, and they sort of said that that whole concept of the observer was a mistake and it's been fixed and it doesn't really mean anything now. What about that?
It's true. There's a deeper level of perspective in which the observer does not yet exist, not separate from the observed. The reality of life today is all unity, unified field which unites observer and observed in one indivisible wholeness. Scientifically, we call it quantum measurement theory, and the ultimate inseparability of the observer from the observed. In the language and science of consciousness, we call it the unity of knower and known in the indivisible structure of pure knowledge, the experience of oneself, the Atman. And what is the self? The self, consciousness, our very subjectivity, is that one thing in our life that has never changed. Intangible though it may be, and very difficult to put your finger on, it's that one aspect of our experience that has been with us since childhood. Although our beliefs have changed, our friends have changed, our bodies have changed, typically for the worse, that one thing that gives that continuity to our experience day by day, that's our consciousness. It's our subjectivity. It's the Atman, the self. And that self, which is the same for you as for me, ultimately, is this unified field discovered by science, which is essentially the creator of the universe. That is our authority. That's our dignity. If we only knew ourself and how precious it was, we would rush to experience higher states of consciousness, where that experience of our unbounded subjectivity is never lost, even during the depths of sleep. I still don't understand. That's okay.
I still don't understand. Can I have you rephrase the question?
Yeah, it's good. It wasn't a very clear answer.
Understand.
Rephrase.
I'm just telling you. What I don't understand is that some people over here, some of the scientists essentially said the observer is not part of the equation.
Right.
And yet, people like you are saying that focused intent affects matter.
Right.
I want to understand those two disparate views.
Okay.
Yeah, what he said.
There are different truths because our universe is hierarchically structured in layers. The atomic has its own truth. The nuclear world has its own completely different truth. And they're both valid. They're both self-consistent. So there's the truth of diversity, where observer and observed are separately identifiable systems, and there's the deeper truth of unity, in which there is no separation between the observer and the observed. So we can talk about life at all levels. Each level is valid, but the deepest level in this scientific age is the level of unity. What has to be very clear about this is a concept most people don't get quite. It's very important. You can drag me across the floor by my arm. You can drag me across the floor by my atoms, or by my nuclei, or by my cells. It all has the same effect. I get dragged across the floor. These are simply different levels of the description of the one reality that is me. So it's legitimate for us to talk about a world of diversity. We see such a world, after all. But it's even more legitimate for us also to talk about the world of unity, the ultimate scientific truth of life. So we get tripped up in semantics if we say that unity alone exists, but there's no such thing as diversity, or that diversity alone exists, there's no such thing as unity. They're both true. They're just different levels of description of the same reality.
So, you talk about me and you are one, but we're also separate. Those are just different levels.
Different levels. On the physical level, you and I are separate. You're much better looking than I am, more attractive in virtually every way. But at deeper levels, we have a common source. And that is the unified field, the scientifically discovered unified field. There's the source of you and the source of me, the source of gravity, the source of electromagnetism, the source of quarks, the source of leptons. Everything in the universe is a common source. So if we look at things at the deepest possible level, we ultimately discover one unified universal reality, of which you're a wave, of which I'm a wave. We're all just the different vibrational frequencies, the natural reverberant frequencies of this one universal unified field. Our whole universe is just a symphony. The various, harmonics and fundamentals and overtones of one universal field, one universal ocean of consciousness in motion.
So let me ask this. I'm just trying to understand all this stuff. So does that place come from the Planck scale? Or is
Yes.
Wow, really?
Yes.
I totally understand it for the first time. Oh my God, I'm so excited.
The Planck scale is that small distance scale, 10 million times smaller than the atomic nucleus, where all the forces come together, where all the particles come together as one, where you and I come together as one reality, where distance, where causality no longer exists, and there's one unified, indivisible wholeness, which is the unity of consciousness, the unified field of all the laws of nature.
Now, in the movie, you said in quantum theory you can also go backwards in time. So I asked David Albert about that, and he said, well, no, quantum theory doesn't say you can go backwards in time. He says the equations of physics have time reversal symmetry, but you can't really go backwards in time quantum, which seems to be different than what you said. So could you elucidate on...
Yeah, we actually talked about it at the cocktail party last night.
Oh, you did?
And we agreed that there may not be anything, such a thing as time, except in consciousness. In other words, outside of consciousness, there may not be a flow of time. Time may exist, but not in terms of flowing in a direction. There may be only this now, this individual now, and then maybe another now and another now and another now, and we connect them through memory and so forth. But outside of consciousness, there may not be a flow of time. So the laws of physics allow time symmetry, reversibility, and so forth. The way I think of it is that consciousness gives our classical world a flow of time, but in the quantum world, time doesn't flow, and therefore we can, from our perspective in the classical world, or at the edge between the classical world and the quantum world, time seems to be going backwards. Now, for example, in the classical, well, in the quantum, in the historical EPR experiments, in which you have two particles that are in superposition and entangled, and you send one over this way and one over this way, and make a measurement here, this one instantaneously reduces to the complementary situation. So there's some kind of instantaneous communication, which would be faster than the speed of light and prevented by relativity. So what a number of people have suggested, Ben Schumacher, Roger Penrose, and others, that the information here goes backwards in quantum, the quantum information goes backwards in time to when the particles were unified, and then forward in time to bring the quantum information. Now, going backwards in time is a problem in terms of causal paradox, because if you could go backwards in time, you could go back and kill your grandfather and you wouldn't be born. But quantum information doesn't really convey that sort of signal. It's more of a correlation. It's more of a qualifying modification of classical information. So I think it plays a role in consciousness in terms of modifying information and making it conscious. You know, there are many things that the brain does that we do that the perceptions seem to take longer to occur in the brain, and we've already responded to them. Rapid conversation. You say something, and before my brain has actually processed and come to conscious realization of what you said, I've already responded. Hitting a baseball at 90 miles an hour is physically impossible according to the perception time in the brain, and yet people do it. There are many illusions that occur where the brain seems to know in advance what will happen. Ben Libet's famous experiments also suggested that subconscious information goes backwards in time. So quantum information, when I say quantum information goes backwards in time, you could say equivalently that in the quantum world there is no such thing as the flow of time, and that in the classical world we have the illusion of a flow of time due to consciousness ratcheting forward and with a sequence of nows that follow one another.
Now, if I was to someone on the street and I heard that, they'd say, well, wait a minute, you say time doesn't really, it's only consciousness. I mean, that's the old question, if the tree fell, would someone hear it? So if someone dropped a basketball on the basketball court and no one was there was no consciousness involved, would the ball still fall? Because the ball seems to fall through different states as time moves forward.
Right. Yes, I think so. And but that would mean that there's a sequence of nows, but maybe only when somebody becomes aware of it. It depends on your interpretation of quantum mechanics. If you are a Copenhagen person, you would say, no, there's a quantum superposition of multiple possibilities, and the ball doesn't fall until somebody observes the ball falling. If you are a decoherence person, you could say yes, it falls because it collapses to one possibility. And if you are an objective reduction person, you would say also that it falls because it has reached the threshold for collapse, or it has decohered. So yes, I would say that it falls. So that's a good question. I stand by what I said, that consciousness gives because the other way to say it is that the ball could also go backwards, and against well, that doesn't really make sense. So I don't know.
Okay, because it's a real head scratcher. What was the?
Excuse me. Well, let me just make one more comment because I didn't really handle it very well. The second law of thermodynamics says that things unwind and move forward. So that gives an arrow of time. But at the quantum world, in the micro world, the second law of thermodynamics doesn't seem to hold, and things can go backwards or be timeless. So in the quantum world, there's no flow of time, whereas in the classical world there is. I think that's probably a better explanation.
So if there's no flow of time, are there any, what experimental data is out there that seems to suggest that the time is funky down at the quantum level?
Well, even in the classical world, Wheeler and Feynman showed that time was symmetrical, and that that electromagnetic information goes forwards and backwards. But the backwards information is only perceived by what they called a coherent absorber. And what a coherent absorber they didn't explain, but Dick Bierman, a physicist in the Netherlands, has suggested that consciousness is such a coherent absorber which is capable of receiving backward flowing information. So only consciousness receives this backward information.
So then, of course, the question now remains, what is consciousness?
Yeah. Well, I define consciousness according to Penrose's view. It's a particular type of self-collapse of the wave function. Now, as you know, things can be in superposition of multiple possible states or locations. That's quantum superposition, and that's the natural state in the quantum world. Now, we don't see that in our classical world. Why not? Well, one explanation is that conscious observation causes collapse. That's the Copenhagen interpretation. Another is that every superposition branches off and forms a new universe, the multiple worlds hypothesis. Another is that interaction of superposition with the environment causes decoherence. And the fourth possibility is that superpositions grow until they meet some kind of natural threshold inherent in nature, which causes them to convert from the quantum superposition state to the classical state. There are several types of these theories which are called objective reduction, an objective threshold for quantum state reduction. One is if the system grows too large, that's the Girardi-Rimini-Weber GRW theory. Another is Roger Penrose's idea that, well, first he starts with the question, what is superposition? And he says it's a separation in fundamental reality at the most basic level. So much like the multiple worlds view, the universe separates and begins to separate, but that these separations, or bubbles, if you will, in reality at the most basic level, are unstable, and after a while will collapse to one or the other. And that this type of collapse, this type of objective reduction that occurs due to this instability in the separation of the universe is consciousness. And it can only happen in very special circumstances because you need a system that's isolated from the environment, so it has to be protected, so it doesn't decohere, and it has to be large enough to reach this threshold. The threshold is given by, it's inversely related to the size of the superposition. So something very small, like an electron in superposition, if protected from decoherence, would take 10 million years to reach threshold, and then it would have a very dull, tiny moment of consciousness. Something very large will reach threshold quickly. And in the brain, we think that quantum computations occur which reach threshold roughly at 25 milliseconds. So 40 times a second we have conscious moments, collapses, these self-collapses, in which the superpositions collapse to the classical world. And it's a process occurring at the most basic, fundamental level of the universe, at the Planck scale, basically, connected to the brain by quantum computations occurring in our brains.
So it almost sounds like you're saying that consciousness arises out of having a brain.
Well, not necessarily. Well, it helps, but any superposition that reaches threshold for self-collapse would have this. And it could happen in a neutron star, which have very large superpositions, but there wouldn't be any information involved. It could have happened at the early universe during the Big Bang, for example, when, for example, some people think that the universe was in superposition during the Big Bang, during the period of inflation, and reached a critical threshold right at the end of inflation, and then collapsed to one universe. And this is a theory put forth by an Italian astrophysicist named Paolo Zizi, who calculated that the period of inflation ended just when the threshold for Penrose objective reduction would have been reached, and that the universe literally had a conscious moment during the Big Bang, and this has been called the Big Wow theory. And so the entire universe would have had a conscious moment at its very birth, and that our consciousness may be related to that initial conscious moment.
So does consciousness exist outside of the body then?
I would say that proto-consciousness exists everywhere at the Planck scale. Proto-consciousness is basically anything that's in superposition. Anything that's in superposition can become conscious if it avoids decoherence and is allowed to evolve long enough to reach this threshold for self-collapse. Now, if it's a very large superposition, and the larger it is, the harder it is to isolate from the environment to avoid decoherence, the faster it will reach a threshold. So an electron, as I said, could reach threshold if it were protected for 10 million years. Something larger, like nanograms of protein in our brain, can reach threshold in 25 milliseconds, and we can have roughly 40 conscious events per second or higher.
So still, if I'm thinking there's all those studies done of out-of-the-body experiences, near-death experiences.
Right.
You'd say in a near-death experience, people, sometimes I saw that documentary you were in where, the persons, they take the brain and they freeze it and it stops and nothing's happening there and the person's up and having all these experiences. How would that fit in with what you're saying? Because it seems like that the consciousness is working independent of me.
Right. Exactly. Well, what I think happens in near-death experiences, and maybe in death also, is that prior to that, while the brain's functioning, metabolism is occurring, quantum coherence and quantum computation is being driven by the metabolism. When that ends, when the blood stops flowing, the quantum information leaks out to the universe at large because it exists in the Planck scale. It exists at the most fundamental level. Even during normal consciousness, it's occurring at the most basic level of the universe. But the Planck scale, the fundamental level, between our ears in the brain. But when the coherence is lost, it kind of leaks out to the universe at large. But it doesn't dissipate entirely because of entanglement, and plus the universe is probably holographic, so it remains with a phase relationship and can persist, at least at a subconscious, dreamlike state outside the body.
So let's talk about creating your reality. I mean, we've gotten a lot of grief on that. Some people say, well, that's not really true. Quantum mechanics doesn't suggest that. Blah blah blah. They go on and on. So what's your take on all that create your reality stuff?
Well, the extreme view would be idealism. Bishop Berkeley and the Hindu approach, which says that consciousness is all there is, and that all there is my consciousness. I'm creating you and the camera and the world around me. And all there is me, and that runs into the problem of solipsism because you probably have the same view, but somehow our realities get along well enough for us to be friends and interact with each other. So, but that is a view that's impossible to refute because I can't really prove that you are out there in reality and have your own consciousness, and you can't prove that I'm conscious. So, idealism, both from the Western standpoint, from what Bishop Berkeley said in the Hindu tradition, is one possibility. Another possibility, the Copenhagen interpretation says we create reality by an observation collapses the wave function. The problem with that is it doesn't say what observation is. It doesn't say what consciousness is. Why is our brain different from a measuring device or anything else? And it kind of puts consciousness outside science. So my view is somewhere in the middle with the Penrose objective reduction, where you have a superposition which reaches threshold and self-collapses and chooses a reality at that point of a number. It's kind of a multiple choice. It's not like starting from scratch anything you want. It's a multiple choice of multiple possibilities for each specific collapse. But the beauty is, this is one of Roger's great contributions, I think, is that he said the Platonic information embedded in the fundamental level of the universe helps to choose or influences which choice is made. This only occurs in the objective reduction. So if you make a conscious choice, if you're mindful about it and don't act rashly, or reflexively, maybe think about it and allow yourself to be influenced by what you want to call instinct or intuition or your higher power or the way of the Tao or may the force be with you, however you want to put it, the quantum information embedded at the Planck scale will influence your decision one way or the other for the good, generally. So it's kind of a way of bringing in some kind of spiritual divine guidance, if you will. So what is the difference between the classical physics and quantum physics? The universe is very strange. There seem to be two sets of laws that govern the universe. In our everyday classical world, meaning at roughly our size and time scales, things are described by Newton's laws of motion, set down hundreds and hundreds of years ago. And they work very well for billiard balls and cannonballs and gravity and then we have Maxwell's equations for electromagnetics, and that's all classical, and that works beautifully. However, when we get down to a small scale, when we get down to, say, the level of atoms, and the actual threshold or cutoff is unclear. It can be actually larger in some cases. A different set of laws take over. These are the quantum laws, quantum theory, quantum mechanics. And at that level, particles may be in multiple places at the same time. They may behave as waves smeared out spatially and temporally. They may be interconnected over great distances. They may be unified into one quantum state, into one state, governed by one wave function. And the borderline, the threshold, this curtain between the quantum world and the classical world is really mysterious. It's called sometimes the collapse of the wave function, because in the quantum world, everything is in superposition of multiple possibilities, and in the classical world, these multiple possibilities seem to collapse to particular definite choices, so everything is in one particular place. This collapse, by the way, is utilized in quantum computation. Classical computers, for example, have bits where information is represented in a binary fashion as either 1 or 0. In a quantum computer, superposition is utilized, and information can be represented in superposition of both 1 and 0 at the same time. These are called quantum bits or qubits. So if you have a system of qubits in superposition, they communicate with each other non-locally. They don't even have to be next to each other. Non-locally, as long as they're isolated in one system. And while they communicate, they process information according to the Schrödinger equation very efficiently. And this goes on for a while and performs computation, and ultimately the system collapses, and each qubit of 1 and 0 chooses either 1 or 0, and that is the output or the result of the quantum computation.
So how do these, you said they communicate, these two things. How do they communicate if one's there and one's here?
How do things communicate non-locally in the quantum world? Well, that's the big question. It's been Einstein, Podolsky, and Rosen tried to more or less disprove this by coming up with a thought experiment, but ultimately their thought experiment turned out to be true. They said that if two components of a quantum system, for example, two photons that were coupled with polarization, opposite polarizations, or two electrons that were coupled with spin up and spin down, were in superposition. So, for example, the two electrons were both spin up and spin down. If they were separated, and one was sent down a wire 100 miles this way, and one was sent down another wire 100 miles this way, when they reached their destination, they would still both be in superposition of up and down. But if one is measured, the other one should instantaneously collapse to the opposite complementary spin. Sure enough, this turns out to be the case. This was first shown in the 1950s, and more recently has been shown hundreds of times in the laboratory. If you have a pair of coupled electrons in superposition both up and down, send one down a wire or a cable to one village, another down a wire or cable to another village, make a measurement on one, the other one instantaneously takes the opposite spin. Instantaneously, which means any information between the two must travel faster than the speed of light, which is thought to be impossible in classical physics. How does this occur? Nobody knows for sure, but one possibility that Roger Penrose suggested is that the information actually from this one goes backwards in time to when they were together, then out the other limb to the other one. And this is used in a system called quantum cryptography, where quantum theory is used to encode information that is basically uncrackable. Another aspect of quantum computing that's very efficient is factoring large numbers into their primes, which is also used in codes and cryptography, so that if and when someone builds a useful, efficient, reliable quantum computer, all military and banking codes will be obsolete. Therefore, governments and industry are pouring huge amounts of money into quantum computation, and tremendous progress has been made. And furthermore, when quantum information technology comes along, when we do have quantum computers, people are going to be more likely to accept the fact that we have quantum computers in our brain, because we certainly wouldn't want something on our desktop that's better than what we have between our ears.
Okay, how does non-locality, could you use that to explain things like ESP and near-death experiences and all that kind of stuff?
Can you use non?
A little hot and dry.
I was going to say entanglement, but you said non-locality.
Well, you could say entanglement. Either one. It's
okay. Can you use quantum non-locality and entanglement to explain things like ESP, near-death experiences, and so forth? I believe you can. I think entanglement and collapse in one system inducing collapse in another is exactly what happens in parapsychological phenomena. And it's also true that time can go backwards, so that they don't even have to be simultaneously. One can occur before or after the other. And near-death experiences, particularly when patients report leaving their body and floating above their bodies, watching themselves being worked on, and then returning to their body, could be due to the fact that consciousness is ultimately a process in fundamental space-time geometry. And when the coherence driving the system stops due to the metabolic insult to the brain, the information is still in fundamental space-time geometry, which is everywhere. So it would tend to start to dissipate. However, due to quantum entanglement, would tend to stay somewhat localized and float above, maybe go out in the waiting room and visit with relatives, which has been reported in near-death experiences. But then when the body is resuscitated, revived, and the metabolic drive in the brain resumes, the information returns to its host, the brain.
Well, do you think many people say that they believe in reincarnation and remember experience past lives and all this kind of stuff? Could this possibly be a mechanism whereby the universe kind of remembers who you are and what your tendencies are, so that the reincarnation process, I mean, could this fundamental information be the bookkeeping of reincarnation?
Could the same sort of thing happen in death and in reincarnation? Yeah, I believe it can. I think the same sort of thing I described, where consciousness leaves the body and returns when the body is resuscitated. If the patient dies, then the quantum information or consciousness, or proto-consciousness, if you will, isn't destroyed and may dissipate or may sort of hang together due to quantum entanglement to exist, I should say, in some sort of afterlife situation, and possibly return to some other body, being reborn subsequently over time, which would account for something like reincarnation. So I think it's possible, if we assume that consciousness, or at least proto-consciousness, meaning something like our subconscious, exists at the fundamental level as a process at the fundamental level of space-time